Well, it's a privilege again to be with you in your Bible class. Maybe you can hear a little bit better that way. There's a handout that you got, and it hopefully does not intimidate you because there's a lot on it. And I'm not sure we'll even get through it all in this one session. We go from now until what time? 11:40? Thank you. So we've got about 40 minutes. In our devotional this morning, we talked about tracing through history and prophecy, the two principles, remember? What I've given you in this handout, this thing called Brief Timeline 1831 to 1910, is an attempt to trace through the history of the Seventh-day Adventist movement a little bit of these principles that we're dealing with. And at the same time, you can see that we're going to weave into this tracing the three threads that we've been talking about: the messages, the landmarks, and the ministries. So that is what we're sort of diving into now. And I'm hoping it's not just going to be dead men's bones like Ezekiel 37, or even dead men's bodies with flesh on them, but that there'll be some life here as well. Because the past is not just gone and dead, as we say. It's actually full of life and meaning. So the brief timeline from 1831 to 1910 covers a period of time, basically 80 years, inclusive if you think of the dates. The reason I picked these dates, 1910 is about 5 years before Ellen White died, and it was a period of time where she was really talking about the importance of our history, as you'll see as we come to the end of this. In 1831, hopefully that rings a bell with you from what we talked about the history already as to what may have been there at the beginning, and we'll see there shortly what that is. So we're going to look at these three threads tracing down through this timeline, 1831 to 1910. And we want to see also the pictures of those used by God in this process. These pictures you will see, there'll be 27 people's faces. And they'll look like old people, right? But again, don't let that confuse you, because by the time they had photography and they could get pictures of these people, they were old. But when they started out, some of them were your age or pretty close to it. So don't think you have to be old to be used by God in His work. You can be used right now. The youngest of them all, I think, in terms of when they started working, was Ellen White herself, age 17, right? When she began to be used by God. So we'll be seeing these pictures. And these 27 individuals, I showed you in the previous program a picture of a graphic of a periodical we did called Lest We Forget. You'll see that same title at the top of the handout, because this actually was a page, a couple pages in one of the periodicals that we did. We have a periodical issue on each one of these 27 pioneers. If you want to find out more about that person or that face or whatever, you can find those articles online, PDF form. Sometimes there's more than one issue per pioneer. And you can find out more about them. There's a timeline of their lives, when they were born, how God used them, and so forth. So you can trace those through. By 1910, the end of this timeline, we will see not many of them are going to be left. And the reason not many of them were left is one of two reasons. Number one, as God began to develop this movement in all of these three threads, they didn't follow the movement in its full development. At some point they said, I'm out of here. I'm not going on with this. And they didn't continue. So you'll see their pictures disappearing. And then, as time even went on longer, some of the older ones began to do what? They began to die. They began to die and pass off the scene. So we come to 1910, we'll see how many are left. You need to realize, too, as we go through this, and this should become clear, that there's been a long delay. We've talked about that before a little bit. But this will give you some documentation that you've probably never seen, at least not in this format or in this detail, as to evidences for what there's been a delay, that there has been a delay. And I say it this way, since we've been looking at the two principles, the truth and the lie. I believe, even though we say as Adventists we have the truth, the doctrines we have are correct, but it's not just doctrines. There's a statement, if you want to write down a reference, look up the book Desire of Ages, page 309. An amazing statement. The greatest deception in the days of Jesus. Do you know what it was? That a mere assent to a certain doctrine constitutes righteousness. Righteousness is not just the doctrines you believe, as true or as important as they are. It's embracing them. So I say in this last sentence on the slide here, the truth has not yet been fully embraced. We may believe the doctrine, we may say, yes, I believe that, but it's sort of up here, it's not here. You know the difference between being here in your head and being here in your heart? You can tell it in a person's life, We know heart things, right? At your age, you understand heart things to some degree. Somebody has your heart, they've got you. Have your head, you can sort of, but it doesn't make a big difference. So I see what our history tells us is that the truth has not even fully embraced. And I'll give you the evidences for that. The truth, again, is the principle that's contending for supremacy against the lie, and the truth can be expressed in all of the teachings that we have as a church. So let's begin the timeline. And across the top of this slide that we're going to be using and building and following as we do the timeline, I'm going to put these three threads: the messages, the landmarks, and the ministries. Hopefully you can see that. And where are we going to start? Well, we're going to start with this face. A little bit dark from there, but hopefully you can tell that we're starting with William Miller. And the date is the beginning date on our timeline, 1831. He begins to proclaim the first angel's message, the first of those messages. So you see it? That's there. I can't really tell that well, but superimposed on his picture in the top right-hand corner, the date 31 is there. Volume 4, I've given you the references here in the timeline on your handout as to where I get these from. Volume 4 of Spirit of Prophecy, it's a set of books that Ellen White wrote before she wrote the whole conflict series. Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 4, page 207. Miller is preaching the first angel's message. What's the landmark under that message? The landmark clearly is the second coming. Christ is coming. Based on the time prophecies, they understood that that was pointing to Jesus coming. And indeed, the prophecies were pointing to the preparation for his coming, but the first event of the preparation is obviously not the coming. You got to get it prepared first. And the ministries also began at this point because from the very beginning, Miller, in 1831, after God twisted his arm, as we explained, he went around holding meetings. People would invite him, come to our church, hold a meeting. Come to our house, give a meeting. We're going to call our neighbors together. Let's have a meeting. They were small to start with. It wasn't until almost 10 years later this thing really took off, as we're going to see. But you can sort of see it right across there. 1831, first message, first landmark, and first ministry was already functioning. What happens next? We're going to see who joined Miller in these early years. And we have there Josiah Litch, 1838. So it's been 7 years Miller has been going around giving his lectures. This man joins the movement. He was an eloquent speaker and a prolific writer. It'd be good to have someone like that with you if you need to get the message out, right? So Josiah Litch joins him. By the way, this is the man who did a Bible study. And he said, based on the prophetic interpretation methods that we're using, on October 11, 1840, the Ottoman Empire will collapse. And people were dumbfounded. They said, you can tell the future that detailed? And everybody was just watching and waiting. They really went out on a limb when he did that, right? And obviously in 1840, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have satellites. If something happened in the Ottoman Empire, which is over there, the Middle East area, Turkey and that area, if something happened there, they're not going to know about it instantaneously. Like we can have a satellite feed, we know exactly what's happening. When the word came in, the evidence, yes, the Ottoman Empire fell August 11. The report is that 1,000 infidels became believers. 1,000 infidels became believers. There were clubs of infidels, people who just said, we don't believe in God, we don't believe in the Bible, and we all get together and we just rejoice in our unbelief. And they published in newspapers. 1,000 of them were converted because they said, this must be accurate. This system of interpreting prophecy must be accurate. Josiah Litch was the one who did that. 1839, this retired sea captain, Joseph Bates, he reads Miller's things, hears about Miller, and he says, this is the truth. I'm going to accept it. I believe what the prophecies are talking about. And he begins to pour the money that he had. He retired with a lot of money as a rich sea captain. He begins to pour that into getting the message out. Also, this man, a preacher in Boston by the name of Joshua Himes. He invites Miller to come to his church. Miller gives this lecture. First time Himes had heard him in person. And he goes to Miller afterwards and he says, do you really believe this? And Miller says, of course I do. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I didn't believe it. Himes says to Miller, why isn't the message going all over the place? And he says, I'm just one person. I can't do it by myself. I'm doing all I can. And so Himes tells him, in the language of today, fasten your seatbelt. We're going to take off. And he begins putting him in big cities. He begins publishing periodicals, books, magazines. He begins something called the Signs of the Times. The Adventists, some Adventists have a magazine still we call Signs of the Times. The first one was published by Himes, came out every week, presenting the messages, the Bible studies, the lectures. He started a periodical called The Midnight Cry. To begin with, it was published every day, like a newspaper. It was sold on the streets of New York City. This man was a promoter. He knew how to get the word out there. And so you can see things are really, really beginning to take off with these men joining Miller. And because of that, that's the date I put in for publishing. Notice there another ministry showed up, 1839. The publishing really takes off. Not that they were not publishing before 39, but it really takes off now in publishing the Advent messages. Who else joins? A man by the name of Samuel Snow. He was an infidel, one of those infidels. He reads Miller's material and he says, this is actually the truth. I believe now the Bible, I believe in God, and he goes from an infidel to be promoting the messages of the Advent movement. Samuel Snow. There's a family by the name of Harmon. And there's a teenage girl who's about 1839. She's about 12, 13 years old. They joined the movement, the Harmon family, Methodist. There's a young man who doesn't look young in this picture because that's a lot of years later. 1841, James White. He'd been a school teacher, but he also became convicted to do Bible work, and he joins the movement as a lecturer, a teacher, preacher. When people grasped this message, they began to share it. God put a burden on people's hearts, and they went out and started sharing it. Before 1844, James White brought 1,000 people to Christ. Another man joins the movement, Charles Fitch, another preacher at another church, different denomination, but he grasped the message in 1841 and also begins to present it. 1842, still another minister, George Storrs. And the reason we picked these individuals was that in a special way they were instrumental, or they were really used by God in specific ways, not just in preaching the message of Christ's coming, but also in bringing other elements of the message as we see it develop in the landmark truths to that. So George Storrs joins the movement in 1842. There's a farmer in New Hampshire by the name of William Farnsworth. He joins the movement. Again, he's in that community where some of the later landmarks really begin to take hold, and we'll mention that later on. He's instrumental in that, but he joins it in that year. 1843, O.R.L. Crozier, a school teacher, he joins the movement. And along the same time, Hiram Edson, a man in eastern New York State, a farmer, he also joins the Advent movement. A young fellow, Jan Loughborough, also joins the movement. This is again the Advent movement under William Miller preaching the second coming of Christ. When I say the movement, I'm talking about the early years and the landmarks and the messages that are currently there as part of the movement. J.N. Andrews, another young man, joins it, a very studious fellow who's really a Bible scholar. So, you didn't see anything happen when I clicked the button that time because it doesn't show very well, but on the top of Charles Fitch's picture, top right-hand corner, there is a number that shows up. I should have put it in white rather than gray. 1844. We've come down to the year of 1844. What happens in 44? Well, in 44, we've sort of filled in the space now between 31 and 44 by showing who joins the movement in those years intervening there. In 44, the churches begin to close their doors to the message. There's various reasons for this, but they begin to say, you cannot preach the Advent message in our church anymore. And they told the members, if you believe this message of Christ's soon coming, you have to leave our church. Again, during those periods of time, Ellen White and her family were kicked out of the Methodist Church. And so I put the number on Fitch's face because he was the most prominent one to present the next message. What was the next message? 1844, the second angel's message, which is what? Babylon is fallen. When the churches rejected the message of Christ's coming, that shows clearly they are not true churches. They are fallen. So that message began to be proclaimed. And Great Controversy, page 389, clearly gives that time for the beginning of the second angel's message. The first angel's message, she said, began with William Miller, 1831. That's in volume 4 of Spirit Prophecy, page 207. What else happens here? That same year, later in that year, actually late summer, a man who's already up on our screen here, the one who's just to the left of Ellen White, a man that's named Samuel Snow, he does a Bible study on Matthew 25. What's the parable in Matthew 25? It's the 10 virgins. And at midnight, what happens? A cry goes out. And so that is when the midnight cry began in late summer of 1844, the third message that's part of this sequence of messages. It begins to be sounded, behold, the bridegroom cometh, go you out to meet him. Be a wise virgin, be ready for him when he shows up. Of course, they're still understanding that coming to be the coming to this earth. And obviously they're not going to experience that. Just before that time comes, October of 44, what happens? Do you see who disappeared? Charles Fitch dies. And we mentioned why that happened. Because he was going around baptizing people that were accepting the message. And as October comes in New England, it's getting cold. And he's baptizing people in the rivers and the ponds or wherever he can baptize them. He doesn't have a heated baptistry to baptize them in. So he gets cold, he gets sick, he gets pneumonia, and he dies. Actually dies just before the passing of the time. So the first one to leave our group here has disappeared. What happens next? Well, I drew it as a line. Okay, passing of the time. This division in the messages and the landmarks and the ministries actually too, as to where October 22, 1844 comes. It's right there. The time passes. Great Controversy, pages 403, 429, 431, speaks about the passing of the time. We call it now the Great Disappointment. Christ did not return to this earth. What happened? What happened? Well, at that point, actually, in the words of Ellen White, as they studied their Bible, as they looked at it, as they began to understand what had taken place, they realized that Christ had not come to this earth. He had gone from the holy place to the most holy place. And in the words of Ellen White, when he did that, he sent an angel down to earth with the third angel's message. So that's where we date the beginning of the third angel's message. Again, realize these messages, when one comes after another one, the previous one doesn't stop. Did we make that point earlier? They join the ones that went before. So it started out as a solo with the first angel, and then it came along with the second angel, and there was a duet. And then the midnight cry came, and there's a trio. And now there's 4 of them, so it's a quartet, right? They're all sounding. They're all continuing. And they're building. It's not that they come with their full force right to begin with. It begins, and then it builds and builds as people understand it and embrace it more. So it begins to sound. Great Controversy 432, Early Writings 254, describes that's when the third angel's message began. Under that message, what landmark truths began to be understood? Well, it's clear. The sanctuary's cleansing was one of the key ones that started right out, because in 1844 the sanctuary was going to be cleansed. They thought it was the earth. And it wasn't the earth, obviously. So what was it? They began to understand the sanctuary is in heaven. Even though it's connected to earth, very closely connected, what God is doing in heaven has a close connection to what's happening here. And we see that through the eye of faith. We don't see any real connections physically, but we know that God's connected. She says it has decided relation to God's people on earth, the cleansing up there in heaven. Cleansing the sanctuary, and then with the third angel joining the other ones, the 3 angels together can be called a landmark truth. She lists those, the 3 angels' messages. And then the third angel, remember, has a banner that he's trailing behind him as he flies through heaven. And there's 2 things written on that banner. The next landmark truth, the commandments of God. But there was one more thing on there. What was it? Faith of Jesus. But if we read later statements about that, they didn't really grasp that one. They neglected it. So I'm going to leave it off up here. Let's skip on down to the next one. Inside the commandments, they saw what? They saw the Sabbath. The heart of the commandments, the 4th commandment. The one that says, remember, and they had forgotten. Christians had forgotten for centuries. The Sabbath came to them, to their understanding. One more, the non-immortality of the wicked. That is, in ourselves, we don't have immortality. We can't live forever. God didn't create us immortal beings. He created us with the potential of living forever, but the ability to live forever is conditional upon what? We embrace the truth, right? we follow God all the way. He's not going to preserve sin forever, right? That would really make eternity very, very horrible. So those are the landmark truths that came in those order. Now, I'm not saying that they didn't exist until the order in which I gave them. They were interwoven a little bit too. But that's one way we can list it. What happens next? We're looking now at who went on with the message. Who accepted the third angel with all of these landmark truths? Did William Miller? No, he did not. So he's gone. He disappears off the scene of the movement. Not that he ever gives up his faith in Jesus' coming. To his dying day, he dies in 1849, 5 years after the passing of the time. To his dying day, he's still hoping to see Jesus come. But he doesn't accept the light of the third angel. He doesn't accept the Sabbath. He doesn't accept the explanation of the sanctuary. How many of the prominent leaders in the early movement did the same thing? Well, Josiah Litch. He didn't accept the Sabbath message or the sanctuary message. What about Himes, the great promoter? He did not go with the third angel's message. He did not continue on. So here's the point I'm trying to make as I'm showing this. God can use you. He can use you in a powerful way. But if you don't keep going on with God in what He's doing, what does the Bible say? Hold fast your confidence unto the end. Right? Cast not therefore away your confidence. Christ said to the Jews that believed on Him, If you continue in my word, then you are my disciples indeed. And you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8:31 and 32. We don't just start with God, we got to continue, right? It's like you weren't just born, you had to grow up. Still in the process of it, perhaps, but it's a process. And if you don't continue on with God, He moves on. Now, I'm not saying that these people are going to be lost for eternity. There's clear evidence that Miller will be saved. Clear evidence for that. In his dream that God gave him in 1847, 2 years before he died, is one of the ways in which we have evidence for that. But he was not able to be used by God with the third angel's message, as God would want to have done it. And we'll find the implications of that as we go through this timeline a little farther. Okay, Miller's gone, Litch is gone, Himes is gone. What happens with these other ones? Well, Samuel Snow, the one who brought the midnight cry message to begin with, he doesn't continue with the third angel's message. Brings the midnight cry, but doesn't move on with the third angel. George Storrs, he brought an understanding of that last of the landmarks, the non-immortality of the wicked, but he does not go on with the third angel's message. Crozier, the fellow down there, it looks like half of his face is white and half is dark. He helped to write out the understanding of the cleansing of the sanctuary, the beginning of the understanding of the third angel's message. He accepts the Sabbath, but does he stick with it? No, within a short time he gives up the Sabbath, he gives up his own explanation of the sanctuary, and he leaves. So Crozier's gone. So, 7 people that we've listed so far stay with the third angel's message and continue going on. Seven of the people. What happens next? Well, we have people now, in a sense, replacing them. Other people that God will use that join with the third angel's message, the movement that understands and teaches that. J.H. Wagner, 1851. Let me say this before we touch on Wagner. Before that happened in 1851, remember we said in 1839 the publishing really took off with Joshua Himes? When the third angel's message began, initially these publications would publish what they wrote about the third angel's message. But eventually those publications stopped publishing anything that they wrote about the third angel's message. So how do you get the word out about the third angel's message? In 1849, Ellen White, 1848 I should say, Ellen White had a vision that her husband James White should publish his own periodical so that the third angel's message could get out there. So by the summer of 1849, James White begins his periodical called The Present Truth. That's a phrase that goes back a long ways. It's in the Bible. It goes back a long ways in Adventism. That's why I went through a study with you as to what the present truth looks like. We could say these landmark doctrines is the present truth, the truth for this time. And so James begins to publish that. The reason I interjected this, because J.H. Wagner, guess what his occupation is? He's a newspaper publisher. God brings in a newspaper publisher. Knows how to write and edit it. He becomes convicted when he's converted to the third angel's message that he should not even be smoking his pipe. He's a pipe smoker. Even though the health message was not really out there in full force, they did have some concepts of temperance, and so he threw his pipe into the wood stove and let it burn up, and he gave up tobacco. So J.H. Wagner, 1851. Another man joins the movement the same year, R.F. Cottrell. His family believed in the Sabbath from way back. They were Seventh-day Baptist. They didn't even join the original Advent movement under Miller because they were not keeping the Sabbath. They were Sunday keepers. So the Cottrell family did not join the movement until they were Sabbath-keeping Adventists. And so they joined it. After having read the articles that James White was publishing for about 2 years now, 1851, he started publishing 49. After reading these articles, because that's how the message got out to a lot of people, they sent the periodicals that James published all over the place. Whoever wanted them, they would send them. The Cottrell family joins. He becomes a writer for the Review and Herald, the periodical that James White is publishing. Writes poetry. He has a poem in one of the early reviews about the Sabbath. Really interesting poem on the Sabbath. 1852, another young man, very talented, Uriah Smith, joins the movement. He's a poet. He's a writer. He's an inventor. He has inventions that are patented, that he made money on the rest of his life. Artificial leg, school desk, all types of things. By the way, he had an artificial leg. As a teenager, they had to saw his leg off without anesthesia. If you can imagine that type of thing. They didn't have it back then. Because he had an infection in his leg, they said the only way he can live is to cut his leg off. So they cut it off. So he lived the rest of his life with an artificial leg. He invented an artificial leg that was better than what they had for him. And he patented it. So he was an inventive man. He was an engraver. He could engrave wood engravings. Guess what he does the rest of his life? He joins that publishing ministry. Becomes the editor of our magazine the rest of his life. Okay? He joins one of the ministries there. Third Angel's Message. He's in his early 20s when he joins it. Another man, an older man, John Byington. He joins the movement as well. And we'll see he plays an important role in one of the other ministries that we haven't listed yet. 1852. Same year, another man, Cornell, M.E. Cornell. He joins it. He becomes a prominent worker in the first ministry that we listed, holding meetings. He's an evangelist. Goes around doing evangelism. 1852, another message came in. Did you see it up there? The fifth of the messages shows up. That's the Laodicean message. We talked about that. I give that year because that's the first year I can find Ellen White writing about the Laodicean messages applying to us. The Laodicean message, the message to the last of the seven churches, is a message that is not a compliment to God's people. It's a rebuke. Okay? But again, I'm a doctor. If I see a patient and they're sick and they've really got serious health problems, do I want to tell them they're okay? Do I want to say, oh my, you're in wonderful health, just keep doing what you're doing? That would be malpractice, right? So Jesus is the great physician. He comes down and he looks at his people. Is everything okay? Read the message. Again, we talked about it before. Wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. Now, if that's the true diagnosis, if I'm a patient and I'm really sick, do I want my doctor to tell me I'm okay? No. I want my doctor to tell me the truth. So even if it's hard, difficult news, we need to understand it. Jesus is the great physician. Does he have a remedy for our sickness? Of course he does. He's not just mocking our condition. He's not giving us a hard time. He wants us to be healthy, right? He wants us to enjoy life. Remember what he told his disciples in John 15:11? I've said these things to you that my joy might remain in you and that your joy might be what? Full. Do you really believe that Jesus wants you to be full of joy? He does. He does. And he wants you to find that the easy way, not the hard way. And how do we receive his joy? He said it. I've told you these things. We have to read what he's told us. We have to receive his word into our heart. But we have to see in his word his heart, right? Because it's a heart that reaches a heart. It's love that finds love. It's faith that finds faith. So we have to see him as he really is. So that's the joy that's there. The Laodicean message is not all doom and gloom. It's full of hope. But we really do need it. So the Laodicean message began. They thought it would quickly finish its work and that they would have the last message come in and then Christ would come. And unfortunately, that did not happen. And we'll find some reasons for that as we go on. That's 1852. 1853. Another young man joins the publishing ministry, George Amidon. You've probably not heard about him because a lot of times the people that are behind the scenes you don't hear about, right? The guy who works in the back office or the guy down there working on the fields and the farm all day long. He's not the top guy. You don't hear about him. How important is he? Vitally important. Things aren't going to happen without him doing. George Amidon was a guy who worked in the publishing work to the end of his life. Publishing ministry, starting in his young years doing that, committing their life to these ministries. Being convicted of the message, in the truths and saying, Lord, what do you want me to do? And God leads them into a ministry. So the question is, are you being convicted of the messages and the truths? If so, the question then is, what ministry is God going to lead you into? What ministry is God going to lead you into? Because if it gets into your heart, you're going to say, Lord, use me. How can I be used by you? And there's a lot of places open and needy in the work. Another young man joins the movement, the Third Angel's Message, in 1853, S.N. Haskell. He becomes a very effective evangelist, a writer. He writes about the sanctuary, he writes about the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation, does powerful evangelism. S.N. Haskell had been working on a farm in his early years as well. And then 1856, a little bit later in the 1850s, another young man, George Butler, joins the movement with his family. His parents, I think, actually become part of it as well. Butler's grandfather was the governor of Vermont. There was a couple here just yesterday visiting from the state of Vermont. This man's grandfather had been a governor of the state. They joined the movement as well. And he becomes, prominent in some of the other ministries that we have not listed as yet. Another man by the name of Pierce, Stephen Pierce. He joins the movement in 1857. He's one of the older men, but he's a very stable. We need older people for stability in any organization, any movement. Those are the ones the Bible calls elders. Elder is not really in the Bible sense someone who gets elected to an office. They're the ones that life has taught a lot to them. And they're anchors in societies and communities. Those are the ones that are elders. And so this man was one of those guys, Stephen Pierce. I don't know why he has an upside down smile, but sometimes they did that in those days. They didn't know how to smile with their lips curled up. Okay, 1857, now we go on to 1860. Did you see something show up at the top? 1860, they're led to begin organizing the ministries. But I see I've run ahead of the outline, so let's go back to that. The Laodicean message began, and the reference for that was Early Writings, page 107, 1852. 1858, just before the organization starts, after Pierce has joined the movement, we find Ellen White writing something. And this is in the book Early Writings, 1858. She's saying, don't move a block or stir a pin. Now, we don't probably understand that imagery like they did back then. But back then, when they built buildings, they used blocks and pins. Pins are what they used to hold things together. Blocks is what they did to make the walls and stuff. So she's saying, changing the metaphor, changing the symbolism from a landmark to a building construction. We've put something together here. We've built something. Don't move a bit of it. Preserve what God has done in the past. Every one of these blocks and these pins are where God wants it. And preserve it. Don't move it. So she's looking back saying that. Early Writings, page 258. But then, in the same book, she's looking forward to the future. Because there's 5 messages there, but there's still one to come. A message is coming, and she says the earth would be lightened with God's glory, with this future message. That was the message in Revelation 18, which they called the loud cry message. So that's looking forward. Early Writings, page 277. So, in 1860, I put up there, the ministry of organization begins, because that's when they decide what we're going to call ourselves. Up to this point, they had been Adventists, believers in the Advent. They had gone with the Third Angel's Message. They'd accepted the Sabbath message. They were Sabbath-keeping Adventists. And so they decided to call themselves Seventh-day Adventists. They were scattered all over the place. They had been built up basically by these early leaders and through the publishing work of James White. The Review and Herald was the magazine. By that time, that's what it was called. It was Present Truth, then Advent Review, and then the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. And that had gone out all over. And people that were reading it began accepting the messages. These leaders joined it. These people who became leaders joined it. And they finally, now by 1860, are organizing, choosing a name, as to what they're going to call themselves. As we looked at that the other day, they also organized a publishing association to hold the property of the publishing work. They also organized into a local conference of churches, which the first conference was Michigan, in the state of Michigan. And then by 1863, according to your outline here, they finally organized what we call the General Conference, the collection of conferences, the different states. In the second volume of her biography, page 31, that's described. The same year, 1863, another ministry begins, our health ministry. And as we mentioned before, it was because they were not in good health. The Laodicean message may have been about their spiritual health, but they had physical health problems too, right? And so what does God do? He sends Ellen White a vision on healthful living. Major vision on how to live healthfully. And in 1863, that vision is given, and that builds over a period of years to where by 1866, they're actually starting a health institution. 3 years after the vision comes, they're opening a health institution. And they've published material already on health. Volume 2 of the biography, page 135. Interestingly enough, that same year, well, I have one more person to bring into the picture at this point. One more lady, believe it or not, Rachel Oakes Preston. And the reason we've left her to this point is not because she was not active till 1867. Actually, back in 1844, she was the one that told one of the early Adventist preachers, "Why are you breaking the fourth commandment?" That's why the Sabbath came back in 1844. But interestingly enough, she did not join the movement of the third angel, which grew out of the 44 movement, until 1867. Sometimes we can understand part of the truth, but we don't embrace the whole truth until quite a few years later. Sometimes it takes a while. And interestingly enough, it was the next year that she died. So she accepted the third angel's message the year before she died. So she doesn't stay there long. She shows up and then she disappears. But think of the contribution that she made in her early years of giving as a Seventh-day Baptist. Before the Cottrell family even joined, as a Seventh-day Baptist, she gave the Sabbath to these Adventists, and they began keeping the Sabbath. Some of them did. And that's where we are at that point. Well, we're not halfway through the outline. It is time to end this class. The last portion of the outline from here to the end is not going to take as much time as what we've got, because we've only got actually 3 more spaces here for 3 more pioneers that we're going to look at. And the other events we're going to be able to move through a lot more quickly. But what I'm wanting you to see is how God used people in the Advent movement, how it tied in to these 3 threads, how that not all of them stayed with the movement, but as some of them failed to continue, God brought others in to replace them. But we're going to move into some other evidences in the last portion of this lecture, which we'll do tomorrow. So bring this back. We may have some extras, but bring your copy back tomorrow if you're making notes or wanting to look at it for the lecture tomorrow. We will continue with this and trace more of the evidences as to why we're still here. Why we're still here. Now this is a long time after these dates we're looking at. And we'll consider some of that. So let's pray to close. Father, we thank you for the chance again to review the history, to see some faces that makes the history a little more meaningful to us, and to perhaps catch a little more of a glimpse of what you were doing back then. Not just to reminisce, not just to experience what we call nostalgia, but because we want to understand what you still want to do. What you started then is not finished. And may we understand what a burden it is to you. Actually, we're told that you are disappointed. So may we understand your disappointment. May we understand more of our history and how to cooperate with you to hasten the finishing of the work that you've started. In Christ's name, amen.